Hello again. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back to the stage the writer-director of Passing, Rebecca Hall. The producer, Nina Yang Bongiovi. And actor, Ruth Negga. So I guess my first question, which is a question you've probably been asked many times, how did this film come about? Because this film is years in the making.
Yes, it is years in the making. I first read the book about 13 years ago. Someone handed it to me. A friend handed it to me. It was at a point in my life when I just started sort of, I guess, vocalizing to people in rooms that maybe the thing that I look like didn't match up with my heritage. It was very confusing for me. I mean, the short story, it's a long story, but the short version is that my grandfather was, my mother's from Detroit, Michigan, and her father, my grandfather, who I didn't know, he died when my mother was 16. He was African American and passed his whole life white, and also Native American, in fact, or indigenous, as we'd say now. But at the time, it wasn't something that I knew. I had snippets of information, whispers, rumors. My mum is an opera singer, and people would write things in opera magazines, things describe her as exotic. And I would spend a lot of time wondering and looking at her and seeing it. And it was hard because the truth is the legacy of passing in a family is that it's necessarily obscured and hidden, and a family protects. I don't begrudge them, I understand it. But I didn't, at the time, all I had was some chat about it. I'm doing the long version, I was trying to do the short version. I'm so sorry. The bottom line is, when I read this book, it gave me context and language for something that I didn't have up until that point. And it was sort of like the key to a great mystery. It was sort of like understanding, oh, this is obviously what happened. This explains why my mother doesn't know any of her father's family. This explains why she can't answer any of my questions. This is what he was doing. And the journey of me writing the script sort of parallels my understanding of all of this in quite a kind of interesting, precise way. I initially wrote the script purely for me. Like it was a sort of out of body, I just have to sit down and immediately write this. I was so full of ideas after reading the book. Yes, the personal reasons got their hooks in me, but beyond that, I was just struck by its modernity. This is a story that centers the emotional lives of two women of color and their effect on each other. It's not anyone external, their effect on it. It's their effect on each other. And yes, she's telegraphing it's about one woman who's hiding her racial identity, but it's actually about the other one who's not hiding her racial identity, but is hiding everything else about herself. And then it transcends the specificity of race and becomes something universal. It becomes this question of how do we all show up for ourselves? How do we all overcome what society tells us we ought to be, what we decide that we ought to be versus what we actually want? And that is huge and felt so huge for me. And I had all these ideas immediately. It's got to be black and white. It's got to be 4:3. I see these shots. It's got to be constrained. They've got to be stuck in the frame. And then Irene is going to be standing there and then Claire's going to overtake her shot. And I mean, I couldn't stop. It was like a sort of, So, I wrote that script and I had all these very ambitious formal ideas for how to make this movie, precise ideas, like things that I'm happy to say made the movie. The feet at the beginning and the scene in the tea room, that was all came up with 13 years ago. But it then went in a drawer because I thought, well, this is crazy. Nobody makes this their first film. You'd have to be a real arrogant. Like nobody has, I better go off and make, at least 4 or 5 films and then I'll get back to this one. Turns out, I don't know, it took a long time. It came out of a drawer after 6 years, and then it was 7 years of actively showing it to people and everybody telling me, this is a wonderful script, very ambitious ideas you have for it, you'll never get this made. And they kept saying that to me, and a lot of people said, well, maybe you could make it if you made it in color. And I said no. I kept saying no. And then, thank God, I met Nina.
Well, that takes my next question away from me. I was kind of going to ask, Nina, how did you come across the script?
So what Rebecca says is really kind of funny, because when agents shared the script with me and talked to me about this project, and then they said, you got to meet Rebecca, but when you meet her, talk her out of shooting it in black and white. Talk her out of shooting it in 4:3 ratio. Like all these things they wanted me to talk to her, and they're talking about the business of this of movie making, and they're like, as a producer, what the value is, and when you do something that's a period piece starring women of color, you got everything stacked against you. So I'm like, okay. So I meet her finally, and as she's describing her vision and everything she's just talked about, I'm here going, yeah. Yes, 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 yes. And then I'm going back to the agents. They called me. They're like, how was the meeting? I'm like, we're doing it in black and white, shooting it in 4:3. So it was pretty wonderful. Yeah.
One of the things, as I watched a film in 2020, I read the book actually in college, so I loved the story. Funny story, it's actually apparently required reading here at one of the schools in Marin, this book, which is very exciting and also not what I would have read in high school. The times have definitely changed. I know. But I remember reading it and thinking, yes, this is a story of a specific person in New York, but it's clearly the story of a diasporic voice, of what it means to be a black woman in general, and what it means to live a space where people tell you what your identity is and isn't. And I wanted to know a little bit, like for you, Ruth, what was it like playing this character, but also coming to this role?
I'm not sure how much that has changed.
Well, yeah.
Because I think the human need for patterns, explanations, boxes, silos is sort of so strong that I think it still exists, and the detriment of that is that, and the good thing about that is that this book spoke to me volumes. And I have always been resistant to labels because I feel people need to label me in order to understand me, and I just think that's the wrong way about going about it, and so that's why this novel spoke to me. And Clare, for me, is one of my heroines because she resists all that, but she's not a martyr and she's not a saint. And she's not pathetic, and she doesn't fall into the tragic mulatto trope. Nella Larsen very cleverly writes against all of those things, and the result is a luminous, complex, nuanced, ambiguous person who, despite these masks that we think she's wearing, is actually very in touch with her true self, her genuine self. And she has managed what I think we're all striving to do, which is to integrate all of our disparate parts and welcome in our ugliness, our energy that might be too much, our desires, and that features very heavily. Nella is explicit with Clare's desires. She said, I want things and I'll do anything to get them. Who has the balls to admit that, And there's just this, she's like a moth to the light of truthfulness. And that's very uncomfortable for many people. And, you know, and I think that's what this book and this film does, is it takes you, it moves you, it disrupts you out of a comfort zone and lingers. You know, I think when I saw it and I left with so many questions and thoughts. And I think that's what our audiences are leaving with, you know, because she doesn't tie it up in a neat bow at the end. And that's what great art does for me. And when Rebecca first came to me with a film, I saw that kind of fever vision that you talk about, you know, that it was a fever pitch, and I saw it in her eyes, you know, and I saw that kind of complete vision, and I thought, absolutely, I'll follow you anywhere to make this.
One of the things that I love about that film is that realization that you go into this story assuming Clare is the one truly trapped. And then you realize that Clare has this freeness, as you mentioned. One of the moments that really stuck out with me is some of the conversations around class, where Claire's inside the kitchen and so comfortable with the person cooking, and you could just see that made everyone else uncomfortable. And I wanted to know, what were the touch points you were thinking of? Because I feel like the film does a lot. Yes, it's looking at race, but it's looking at class. It's looking at femininity, what it means to be a woman, what it means
sexuality.
to be a mother. Well, yes, there's what it means to be sexual, what it means to be a mother. So what were the kind of touch points you were looking at?
That's a big question, and it posed a lot of challenges as a something to adapt and also something to direct, and I kind of think the two were slightly intertwined in my head. I couldn't, you know, a lot of the formation of the shots and thinking about the composition of finding a sort of an eloquent language within the frame to try and reveal some of these more complicated things was very much intertwined in my process of writing it. The fundamental problem was really, you know, Clare was a dream to write because, you know, like Ruth is saying, she's free. She actually says what she feels. And literally nobody else in the story does. And everybody else is passing, actually, on some level. And it was the real problem was, how do you reveal the interiority of your lead character and her unreliability to an audience gradually in a way that feels ominous. Ominous is the wrong, you know, but just feels like it's sort of creeping up on you. Like you're sort of, I wanted you to feel that you start off, Irene is morally correct. You know, she's a good woman. She is righteous. She's a mother. She's a good member of the black community. She's living her truth. And then slowly I want you to feel that she's not seeing things clearly. And that was a problem because you can't, you know, even if you could crack open Irene's head, what's inside would be revealed to be lies anyway, because she's not aware herself that she's having a breakdown. So it became a kind of developing a visual language and a symbolism, honestly, you know, and a lot of it, sort of accessing her interiority, a lot of it was sound design, which was huge for me. I think I did 3 sound mixes in the end, two proper, yeah, but I mean, it was 3 actually. And that was always something that was in my head from the very beginning, is like sort of find a subjective way to I can only speak through examples, really. So in the beginning, when she's in the tea room, the first time she sees Clare, she hears her before she sees her. She hears this laugh, and it goes past her, and she sort of bristles, like the air has just changed in the room. And then when she sees her, the first thing she sees are her legs crossing. And the sound of the nylons rubbing against each other is unnaturally loud. I mean, there's no way that she would hear it from that distance. But this was sort of was finding an expressionistic language that accessed Irene's sensuality, actually. Because she's not really in touch with her sensual self, but she's unlocked by Clare's presence because it triggers her in this sort of, wait, who is my real self? So it was fine, you know, things like the oral landscape. sort of focusing on what Irene is seeing and then sort of drip feeding the idea that she's not seeing clearly, which becomes about blurring things, quite literally, like defocusing. And, you know, she comes down the stairs and she sees them standing very close together, or she thinks she does, and then she turns the corner and in reality they're, you know, 10 feet apart or whatever. These kind of, like, she sees a bigger crack on the ceiling than her husband does, and when she's even dreamier, she sees it even larger. That it was a symbolic landscape as a way of accessing the dread, as a way of accessing her breakdown. I suppose the other really obvious one is, you know, Claire talks about, she says, "I'm not safe." And it's this wonderfully, deliberately ambiguous moment. You're not really sure if she's saying, "I'm not safe because I'll do anything I want to get what I want," or if she's saying, "I'm not safe because my life contains this constant seed of danger." Regardless, she's honest about it. She can say it, and she doesn't behave in that way. But Irene is literally not safe. Like, she literally breaks everything she touches. So I had her dropping a flower pot, dropping a teapot. She's like this sort of, she's actually a powder keg, but you don't sort of necessarily notice that until the very end when you're wondering, well, what else did she drop? Everyone's like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe. Maybe. But also, you know, then now we're heading on the other kind of like very difficult dilemma of the story, which was holding all the realities all at the same time. And that was a very delicate dance that was really sort of focused in the edit. You know, it became this actually fantastic, for me, puzzle. I could have edited this film for my entire life. The tiniest thing that you could do in the beginning would suddenly tip it so it felt like, oh, absolutely, he's having an affair. And I'd be like, well, I don't want that to be true. So then, you know, stick in a very, very quiet, tiny, 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 he says, I love you, right at the end. So anyone that's pretty sure that he's been having an affair all this time might just leave the cinema thinking, oh, it was all a projection on Irene's part. It was, but I wanted all the things to be true. I want some people, you know, if you're whatever you're bringing to the movie is probably the lens that you're going to see it through. You know, there are some of you that are going to think it's a movie about adultery. There are some of you that are going to think it's a movie about repressed homosexuality. There are some of you that are going to think it's about internalized self-hatred within the systems of racism and patriarchy. All of these things are true.
My next, well, I guess after that eloquent answer, I feel like my next question is going to be a little bit silly.
Please.
But like, one of the things that I find interesting at this point in time, I mean, you've been working on this film for some time, but like we are looking to the past more and more, especially for BIPOC voices, to inform our present. And Ruth and Nina, you are not strangers to looking to the past in the work. So kind of, what attracts you to these stories of the past, I guess? As you mentioned, there was, unfortunately, it was very, you understood the character because it didn't feel like it was too far apart from our current. So like, what do you think kind of attracts us to the past at this particular point in time, especially for BIPOC voices?
Well, I mean, I've always had an interest in history, always fascinated. And I suppose just watching lots of old black and white films and never seeing anyone like me centered. You know, we're always on the sidelines holding like a nice tray or something. And you think, where's our stories, you know? And I feel like films like Passing are sort of part of a canon that's addressing that lack. And for me, you know, that's where my interest lies. It's really that simple.
From my end, I feel like some great stories are from history or from people in history that have affected change, that had created a lot of impact. And I think in this day and age and this time right now, because there's so many challenges when it comes to BIPOC voices, we do go back to say, well, how long has these challenges been? Where were the changes that have been made? What we look back at history of like what worked and what didn't work and try not to repeat it. And when it comes to storytelling, the gift that we have is to be able to tell stories that hopefully shape your perspective and humanize, especially BIPOC talent and stories. And that's what inspires me, is to find these stories to humanize many of us who aren't, white Americans. It's like, so that's the big inspiration. And the period pieces are really, really tough, especially when you do look at Black or Indigenous or Asian or Pacific Islander stories, because we're always told that our stories are worth less, or there's no marketability, that it doesn't travel overseas. Like everything that I've been told is not true, So my goal is to consistently dig into the past and incredible characters that are flawed, that are heroes, that are, from the whole spectrum of telling their stories. And we're so fortunate to be able to do so. Like, for example, there's so much Asian hate going on right now. And it's like, how do we change people's minds and perspectives and humanize Asian Americans? How long has Asian Americans been in this country? Oh, for quite a while, So those are the stories that I'm looking for, and hopefully bring that to the forefront so others will see us as humans. And empathize and be compassionate, but another big goal is to create solidarity amongst all BIPOC storytellers and audience, and say, what, we have to create solidarity amongst all of us for us to be able to change the system and see the shift in the paradigm of how we see each other.
Well, this is possibly another silly question, but one of the things I love about Clare is her laugh. She has this energy that fills the entire room in every one of those scenes. And I don't know, maybe this is a silly question, but what's going on with Clare's laugh?
Listen, I worked on that for days because mine is actually a hefty cackle. And I don't know if that would have worked out. I wanted a more of a tinkle. So that was what I was aiming for, an attractive tinkle. Well, the thing is, this, the brilliant thing about Clare was how charismatic I found her, She glows from this screenplay. And the problem is that how do you play that? It's very hard. So you do rely on everybody else to do that work for you, and you really do. It's you can't do that yourself. I mean, it's counterintuitive and it doesn't work. So I relied on Tessa to do that job for me. Yeah, it's peculiar, isn't it? She has this sort of. I feel like she's like a lighthouse. When that light is on people, it's so penetrating and disarming and kind of scary and uncomfortable, but kind of addictive because you feel seen by people who really look at you. And that's something I noticed when I was watching the film and I tried to do in the performance, is that when Clare sees people, she really takes them in. It's not a glance, it's really... It's sort of she's listening, she's using all of her senses, and when someone gives their whole attention to you, you feel special and loved, and that was an important facet of her, and she also likes being looked at. That was important. She invites a gaze, and she doesn't mind being at the center of attention. She quite likes that, and all of these things that we kind of are taught, I feel, to look upon as bad vanity. They're actually not. They're someone stepping into their power and being comfortable in their skin, which is the irony of it. And that for me was important, to see a woman of colour and her desires, her desire to be looked at, her desire to want things, her acknowledgement that motherhood isn't all it's cracked up to be for her. You know, these are kind of radical notions, especially for that time, but actually still now. And I think what it boils down to is Claire has this joie de vivre, you know, this need to live. You know, she's going to make her wild and precious life matter to her. And that's so revolutionary, really. So that's what I kept kind of running through my head. But really, it's the ensemble that kind of does the trick for you, you know?
I spent the film feeling like I wish I had a bit of Clare in, like I had that in me, that confidence, that ability to so comfortably live this life of danger, but still be completely one with themselves in a way that, like we all talked about, no other character could be. And I found that so interesting, that a movie that I went in, like also a book that I went into assuming that I was going to strongly dislike one character, and then come out of it like mesmerized. And I think, I mean, when I saw it on the page, it's one thing, but seeing you play her, like it was stunning. It really was. It was just kind of like what I saw on page. I mean, you just clearly have amazing vision, because like I read that book and did not think 4:3 ratio in black and white. And it's, I think if Nella was today, she would be so, like that's probably what she was thinking as well. I think it's just absolutely grand. And you were an amazing Clare, and you just had this phenomenal vision that took this story and just made it alive in a way that, I don't know, when I read it in college, I maybe didn't have the eyes to see at the time.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
So we are heading towards the end of our time together, which makes me very sad. I could talk to all three of you forever. What is a moment in the, well, because this is a very long filmmaking process for you. What was a moment where you knew that like you had it, or like this was, this, like, I try to describe it as a moment of joy, but I imagine there was many moments of joy. But what was like one of those moments, and for everyone, what was a moment of joy in this process for you as you were creating this?
It was to see friendship like that on screen. I've never seen friendship like that. The depth of love, the attraction, the moments of being repelled by someone you love, being fascinated, being jealous, wanting them to be happy, but also feeling sort of, kind of coveting that happiness, and all those complexities and nuances. For me, you know, I just saw two people who just sort of completed one another in a way. And I think that's because, I mean, I don't know, this is my own feeling, these are sort of two embodiments of the spirit of Nella herself and what she was grappling with. You know, the idea that, you know, you want to be free, but you also have a responsibility to your community, you know, and where those, and how those tensions fit together. And I think there's so much in there that I just think it's like, it's modern, but it's like beyond modern, you know. I don't think we're ready for it. Or are we?
I'm trying to think. The truth is there was an awful lot of joy. There was an awful lot of, it was a really...
Cackle heavy set.
It was a cackle heavy set. Beyond Ruth Negga's sizable cackle. No, it's just, you know, making a film is hard. You know, it's like, it's really hard. And it's hard to, especially when you're making an indie film that's super ambitious in 23 days, and you can't 23 days, by the way.
In Harlem.
Thanks for that intake of breath from everyone. In Harlem, and we were in Harlem, which was amazing. But I suppose what I'm saying is, like, every single one of those 23 days, I marveled at the crew and the cast, because no one was getting paid properly and no one was working decent hours, and it could have been a hellscape and everyone could have been miserable. But there was real passion on this one. And you see it. Like, there was real love for this project.
And the dance hall.
Oh, and that dance.
was extraordinary.
And we filmed the dance hall. Talk about a moment of joy. That was actually the last day of filming. And there was this, and it was, I set it up to be this sort of purposefully, everything feels very constrained and restrained and bound, and then there's this sudden sort of burst of exuberance in the middle, and then you're back to being bound again. But because we shot it at the end, it was like this huge release, and it was so intoxicating and so celebratory to watch all of those bodies just going for it and just sticking there. I could have shot that for forever, but it was, there was so much genuine love for this that I felt, extraordinarily privileged and humbled to look at it every day.
So my moment of joy is because all of us put our name, our lives, our everything on the line for this. I know that. And our heads of departments, our crew that came through, they were some of the best folks that came through that didn't have to do this film, but they did because they loved the book, they loved her screenplay. For me, for the moment of joy is watching the monitor, and when I saw the frame of Tessa and Ruth, and I was just like, oh God, we got this, because I had to talk to investors listen, this is amazing, it's gonna be a piece of cake, and but you have to put that, up front so they feel the confidence to bet on this film with us. And so that moment, that first frame, seeing you and Tessa, I was like, this is brilliant. And the way you framed everything, and I was like, we got this. And that was my moment of joy because I didn't want to hear it from investors. And then furthermore, huge moment of joy is when Netflix came through.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. They came through and say, we see you guys. We see the value. We see the love that you guys all put into this, and we're going to back you guys. So that's huge for us. Yeah. Big moment of joy.
It was a huge moment of joy. Also a tiny moment of smugness. Purely for the basis of years, people saying this is not commercial, it'll never sell, it'll never have a life. It was like, oh yeah, it's sold.
Yeah.
I wanted to say thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for this amazing film. Thank you so much for your artistry. This movie feels like a revelation because it is, as you say, so rare to see these stories on screen, to see such a full person on screen. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Milvary.